Hello, everyone. It's Mushin-Makedonskiy, and we are back to Business of Stories and Storytelling in Business. Today, we have a special guest. I welcome John Capecci, co-author of Living Proof, the book on storytelling for advocacy. What it means, we are going to explore it in this episode of the podcast. And he's also the co-founder of the consulting firm of the same name and communication consultant, a story coach, and an amazing human being who helps people to get their stories out to prove that some things in life have a lot of meaning. So, John, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you for finding the time to join us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for reaching out. It's good to meet you.
It's good to meet you too. John, for starters, can you tell me what, and my audience, of course, what is advocacy and how did you find yourself doing it as a life, purpose?
Sure. So when we talk about advocacy, we think of it very broadly very simply, as whenever you speak out in support of something you believe in and you are advocating for some kind of change. So that's advocacy for others, to help make others' conditions better, or it could be advocating for a new law or a new policy or to stop a behavior. It's that general, that whenever you speak out in support of or in defense of something you believe in, that could be an organization, it could be a mission. And what's interesting, that the word advocacy, the root of the word is Latin vox, V-O-X, which is voice. So at the root of any advocacy really is speaking out, speaking up. And so that's really where we focus in terms of the kinds of storytelling. These are advocates who have made the important choice to speak out and use their stories in defense of or in support of a particular cause or mission or on behalf of others. Does that make sense?
It does, and it does make great sense. I mean, I understand that it can be used in individual goals or in corporate goals in terms of, business stuff, or in terms of things like, providing people with homes or food and stuff like this. So it can be used in different areas, right?
Yes, absolutely. But the distinguishing factor is that I'm speaking out on behalf of others or on behalf of something else. Okay. So it's not, I'm just telling my story to get my story out there. It's not, and we can talk a little bit more about this because I think it's a really interesting aspect of this type of storytelling where it is my story, but I'm clearly doing it for the benefit of the good of others. So I have a very clear focus that I'm telling my story in order to create some kind of better condition, a better world, a better life for others. So that's the general world that we work in terms of storytelling.
Great. I like that perspective. I always tell my students that if you tell a story, you should be telling it first for the benefit of your listener, then for your own goals. And what I'm hearing from you is that and a person who is advocating should be telling a story for the benefit of the third group that he's advocating for. Did I get it right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can talk more about this as we talk about the specific nuances of this. But one of the things we find is with advocates who are really successful at telling their stories is that they have a very clear vision of who they're telling the story for, or the world that they're hoping to create with that story, the better world. So I'm telling my story. That's why we call the book Living Proof, Telling Your Story to Make a Difference. That's the main focus in a general sense of why I'm telling my story this time.
Perfect. So that's a great start to a conversation about what's so special about these stories. And I would really like to dive into it. So what is really the difference between these stories and, the other types of business storytelling in your view?
Well, actually, I'll turn it back to you first for a question, because I know that a lot of your work is you're sort of looking at the various uses of stories, and with a real focus primarily on business storytelling, which is such a powerful use of
Yeah.
story. So when you look at how stories are being used in the business context, why are people using stories? Do you see within the business context? Why do they
Yeah.
tell?
That's a great question, and I wasn't anticipating a question on this talk, but okay. To be honest, the first and foremost is influence.
Yeah,
To influence someone into doing something, and sometimes it's manipulative influence, or sometimes it's a more engagement rather than influence. That's like the first layer. There are more layers, like creating a community, which is the work by Mary Alice Arthur. Healing stories, which is, you know, the primary goal of narrative therapy and stuff like this. But those are the rarest in business. More influence right now, I would say.
yeah. Yeah. See, that's because it's really interesting for me to hear because, and as you and I have talked about previously, there's so many different reasons why people tell stories and employ, and the context is everything. So even though there's a lot of work with business storytelling these days, and as you said, healing, therapeutic forms of storytelling, but I think the difference for using personal storytelling for advocacy is in two ways. First of all, it is a personal story. This is not, I'm not fabricating a story or coming up with a good narrative that's just going to be, it's going to be engaging. I'm pulling from my lived experience. So these are all of the stories are rooted in our lived experience. That's the one distinguishing factor. And then the other is, again, going back to the intent. I am doing it for the benefit of others or benefit of good. I'm not doing it to sell a book or sell a product or develop my leadership skills or engage customers. And so those are all very specific and powerful uses of story. But in an advocacy setting, it really is the intent has got to be clear. I am telling my story in order to create a better world, to advocate for others. And the reason I think it's so important for advocates that are most successful to be very clear about that is that when you start to sense as a listener that somebody is telling their story for another kind of purpose, like, I want you to visit my website, I want you to donate money, I want you to buy my book, it becomes less persuasive and less authentic. If you say that you're telling your story because I'm going to benefit or I can help create a better world, but you really underneath it want to support your business, that's the difference, I think. That's the difference between this particular context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I've really seen people telling these stories, and the reaction of the group would be like nodding, but then not doing. And, you know, yeah, I get
Yeah.
it. I get it.
Yeah. And
So,
that, I'm sorry,
yeah, go on.
you just brought up another really great point of why this kind of storytelling is also very specific in that it is storytelling to create action. So it's persuasive, like most storytelling is on some level. It's, as you say, creating influence, but it is always with the end goal that I'm asking you to do something for hearing my story. There's something we can do together because of what this story tells us. So it is always pointed to some specific action that we want others to take because they've heard our story.
So it's, again, I've had a podcast with Bill Baker. I don't know if it's uploaded yet, but he was talking about strategic use of storytelling. So here again, there should be a strategic goal. Why are you doing it? What action should you be bringing up? And I like that it correlates with like essentially business storytelling, but it has a difference. Thank you for clarifying that out.
Yeah, and there's that phrase that sometimes we say when people want to just throw story at something, because story's magic, it's just going to have the effect. It's like we say, no, story isn't magic unless it's strategic. So there has to be some
That's good.
thought in order for the story to have the power that we all believe stories are going to have. It still has to be strategic.
Yeah. Yeah, that's like using the right tool, but knowing how to use this tool. Yeah, exactly. John, here's the question I would really like to explore here. what if I would really like to dive in and feel the power of this storytelling for advocacy, and I have to protect someone or something, some idea. Um, how do I reach it? Like, there are numerous stories in my life that I just feel that a lot of events that happened, and is there any simple answer to how do you construct this story, or it depends on the case? So how do you view it?
So I think this is the slightly different approach that I think advocacy storytelling takes. Rather than saying, well, tell me your best story, that's not where we start, because people tend to think, oh, the best story is the most dramatic one, or the one that has all of the story features that we know work, rising action, conflict, all that good stuff. But is that the story that's going to make the difference? Is that the one that links up to what your advocacy goal is? So the first steps in our process is, big surprise, going back to the intent to say, first of all, why are you doing this? What is it you want to accomplish? What is it you want people to do or to know or to learn? And let's get clear on that. And then go back and do all that wonderful exploration of my experiences, to say, I've got this much that's happened to me in my life. Which is the piece that really says is the living proof of why this is important? So it's going back and forth between, again, being clear on what it is we want our advocacy to accomplish, and then that creative, reflective step of saying, so what is it about my experience that will help others understand why this is important? So that's the first. There really is that exploration. It's the same creative exploration with the strategy, right from the start. Why am I doing this? And then what have I experienced? So I know that you were familiar with the book, but we have a number of exercises throughout the book because it is a developmental process. I wish that there was just a simple 4-step process to it, but
We all do sometimes.
right. But that's just not that's not the reality of how we work. And so we have a lot of developmental exercises for people to thought pieces. One of them is to do a story map, to just say, okay, I'm going to forget about what a good story is, or even what I'm comfortable telling. This is all my private exploration, and just trying to get out in front of you everything you have to work with. That is an important part for advocates, I think, to say, I have this much experience, before you start assuming that story is the one story I'm always going to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Again, when we do workshops and we work with advocates or organizations, a lot of times they're really surprised that we don't start there and say, what's your best story? Or how are we going to craft this? And it's like, that's really not what this is about at this point. It's about intent and goal, and then reflection on what it is you've learned. I'll say one other thing about this too, is that the reason why that's such an important place to start is that very often people don't value all of their experiences. We don't always think that little thing that happened to me, or that thought I had, or that something that someone said to me is going to be engaging enough. And the truth of the matter is, sometimes it's the smallest moments, sometimes it's the quietest moments that make someone go, I get it now. I understand what you've experienced and why this message is important. So there's a sort of internal competition we all have, where we think our stories aren't big enough, their stories aren't dramatic enough. But that's also what's different about advocacy storytelling, I think. Yep.
Yeah, I like how you position that. Even the smallest moment can have the greatest impact, and that's a really great thought. You know what I wanted to ask you next? I feel that in this process, as you're saying, there is a part where you discover your purpose in advocacy, then you find the right story, and then you make it technical, like, adjustments, structure, and stuff. It goes on the latest point. Um, can you just, before we dive into this third section, can you treat me with an example of a person, or maybe a student of yours, that was really clear on why he's doing it, he or her, and that made him or her find this story and this authentic moment? Maybe an example from your practice.
Yeah. So, the first thing that came to mind is a story that an advocate story that we talk about in the book, and named Jacob Smith. And Jacob was in a terrible car crash um, uh, due to a distracted driver, and suffered really traumatic brain injuries and facial reconstruction. And while he was in the hospital, he at that time said, "I've got to tell my story so this doesn't happen again." So as soon as he was well enough to go out and speak, he started being asked to come and speak to high schools, to young people in colleges, to talk about what happened. And I love this moment that Jacob said, and he realized that he was being asked to tell his story for the wrong reason. People wanted to hear what happened, but they weren't getting the message. And so all what they were left with was how terrible this situation was for Jacob. And that's when he had an aha moment and said, "You know what, I got to stop for a bit. I've got to go back and I've got to think about what is it I want to achieve? What is it? Why am I telling my story?" As far as some of these audiences, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but he said, as far as some of the audiences were concerned, I was just another person who had been in a crash. Now, if that's all they think, I'm not getting their job done. So I thought that was a really, he was so smart to recognize that the story alone, as impactful and as dramatic and as well as he told it alone, was not enough. It's got to be that strategy too, to say, and here's what we can do about this, and here's what, so here's the message that I want to deliver. And so he stepped back and he rethought and retooled, and became even more effective. That's the first one that comes to mind, just in terms of finding that moment of realizing, oh, this is really how I should tell my story, and what else I need to say around my story so that it has the impact that I want to have.
What I'm hearing is a great example of what you can frame your story into to help it make an impact. So if I'm hearing it right, he first had an experience, then he realized the purpose of what must be done, like after an experience, which is an often case with such life traumas or instances. Here's the question I would like to ask, and I feel it like buzzing in my ears from the audience, I guess, who are listening. And the question is, how did his story change from before to after? Like, what was so special? What made it work for the strategic goal and for the good of the audience?
Yeah. So he said, if I'm remembering correctly, that when he was asked to speak, he thought he would just show up, say, "Here's who I was before. Here's who I am. Here's what happened, the crash, and here's how I got better." That's only what happened. And he realized that he needed to, as you pointed out, think about who the audience is and what can they do. Now, where do they enter into his experience to say, well, what does this mean to me? What can I do? What do I do when my dad is driving and picks up his phone? What are some specific actions I can take that something like what happened to you doesn't happen to me? So it was moving beyond the story to the strategy and the messages and the action. We always say we want to move people, and the power of our stories is that they create empathy, right? When they work, we know that people feel with us, imagine with us, but if we just stop there in an advocacy setting, we're missing the goal. We've got to move from empathy to action. And I think that's what Jacob realized, why it was unsatisfactory to just show up and tell the story. Because then all you leave people with is, that's a really sad story.
Yeah, there's no action that looks like a stand-up, which is not a bad thing for a stand-up or a moth competition, but it's not what we in business or in any terms of strategic storytelling would assume to be a good story. That's great, but let me get a little bit more technical and I'll step down from it. So I feel that he added some strategic prompts that asked the people to be more specific about their actions and, to do something. But were there any changes to the story itself in terms of how he told it, or the words he used inside the story before these action prompts that made the audience connect better, in your opinion? Or maybe,
Yeah, I'll broaden it beyond Jacob, because we see this happen with so many advocates who are telling the stories. And I can't say I've heard Jacob's whole process throughout.
Yeah.
But especially when stories do come out of trauma or pain, and not all of them do. As I said, they could be a quiet moment of, here's why I farm the way I do. But when they come out of trauma and pain and drama, that because we're conditioned to think that the best stories are the most dramatic and dwell there, is that advocates very often feel they have to really go to the dark and be very specific, be very graphic, spend this much time talking about the darkness of what happened, and then at the end say, so don't let this happen to you. So that's 95% of the tragedy in this case, and 5% of action. So I'm pretty certain with Jacob, because I have heard him tell stories after he had that revelation, but with so many other advocates too, it's a matter of figuring out how to balance that. Do I really want to spend that much time in the graphic details? Do I really want to spend that time creating that much emotional impact before I get to, now here's what we can do, and here's what the world is going to look like, and here's specific things you can do, here's what I learned, and what we all could, in spending more time with that part of the advocacy talk. And that's one of the 5 qualities that Tim and I have sort of settled on, is when advocacy stories work the best is when they point to the positive. And in situations like we were just talking about, when the story comes out of pain or trauma, that's sometimes really hard to strike that balance, but it's a really necessary one too. And the point we always make with individual storytellers is that when we say we have to point to the positive, that doesn't mean we're sugarcoating this, or that you don't talk about what the hurt was, what the pain was, and make people understand that. But then how do we balance that with the action, with the strategy as well? And that, even though I think that makes cognitive sense to all of us, it's like, oh yeah, of course you'd want to get to a call to action. When you're in the experience, sometimes it's hard to remember that I need to get there, because the story is so important. And that's sort of the irony of this. If we leave people only with the story, then we may not be achieving our advocacy goal. So going back to your question, my guess with Jacob, but I've certainly seen with other advocates too, is that they do more editing. They, rather than saying, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this, it's, here's what happened. Here's a moment that I wanted to illustrate. Here's another moment. So you see the importance or see what happened, but here's then what we can do. So the story becomes more strategic, more trimmed, just as powerful.
Perfect. That's a great explanation. I mean, and what I like about it is that you've made it from what happened from a chronological point of view into a moments, and that's a great way to illustrate it. That's I feel that it's like one of the key components to having a good story is having enough moments rather than having a chronology. Well, since we're diving into it, can you share some more insights about what makes a really good advocacy story?
Sure. Well, this is the main question that Tim and I have been asking for almost 20 years. So we all believe that stories have this power, but when do they work and when don't they work? And we sort of settled on what we call the 5 qualities of a well-told advocacy story. And I've already alluded to a number of them. So real quickly, it's like the first one is focus, and that is the more clearly your story is focused and linked to your message and to your goal, the more successful your advocacy is going to be. The second is the one we were just talking about, pointing to the positive. We have got to point to the positive when you tell your story within an advocacy setting. The third is the third. It's, you know, you wait till you get to 3 to even talk about craft. But that is one of the essential. Again, we don't start there and say makes a good story, but we say, okay, there's your goal. Here's how you're pointing to the positive. Now, are you using vivid language? Are we getting to those moments? Are we trimming? Are all of the good storytelling techniques that we know engage listeners? The fourth is that a good advocacy story is framed. You had mentioned earlier the importance of framing, and that's just the things we say around our story that help people understand why we're telling it and who I am. When you say my story is a story of hope, that's a frame, and it helps your audiences understand how you want the story to be heard. And then the fifth one is, and this comes out of our background in communication training, it's got to be practiced, not rehearsed and set in stone, but because telling a personal story publicly is such a significant act, we've never go into a public communication setting when you didn't feel confident and comfortable and in control. And that requires practice. So those are the 5: focus, point to the positive, craft, frame, and practice.
Perfect.
And those provide some pretty good anchors.
Yeah, and it really looks like a process, and at the same time like a checklist you have to have. Here's a tricky question though. Since I've since I've been working in storytelling for, you know, I've been researching the literature for quite some time, and I've seen that people talk differently about framing. And here's the question for you. There are people like Murray Nossel who view the framing like as it is extra, and you should be only focused on what happened, and you should be telling from the point of view of your eyes, your ears, and your senses. And he's extra great at creating the moments and establishing the moments, and it's more like a therapeutic approach. And again, on the other side of this continuum, there's like Paul Smith, who says you should tell your story. Before your story, you should be telling an entrance, like a small construction to, you know, enter the story, to grab the attention, and then you have to be on the exit, and then some kind of a moral and, you know, an action statement and stuff like this. Mm-hmm. And there are 2 points on this axis. And one says that you don't need a lesson. You just need to tell what happened. People will understand. And the other people tell that, you know, you should have this frame on both sides. So what view do you see? Like, I wouldn't say the right one, but can you reflect with me on some time on this matter? What is the right way to frame your story?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and very well laid out in terms of the different approaches. We fall on the end of the spectrum where there's a lot we have to tell around our story. Now, that doesn't mean there's always one recipe to do that. There's a lot of different ways to check those boxes, to achieve, to point to the positive, to frame, to do all those things around a story. There's some good models out there, and we offer in the book and in our workshops, like, hey, try this one, see if this works for your situation. But we typically don't rely on the story alone, because our goal is to achieve some kind of action or to have some really specific impact. That more often than not, if you just cross your fingers and tell the story, I mean, I feel like you're just leaving it to chance sometimes. Sometimes that story is so powerful that people go, wow, I have got to rethink the way I'm doing things because of your story. But more often than not, I think, Tim, and I think you've got to connect the dots for your audience to say, I'm telling the story, but I'm telling it because I believe there's something we can do so this doesn't happen to other people. There's my frame. And I think, and people walk into any room, anytime they're listening to any story, already with their own frames, right? Oh, this is going to be a sad story. Oh, this is going to be a happy story. Oh, this is going to be someone who just wants the attention. What can I say to address those frames? Say, here's what my frames are. Now, you're not going to change someone else's frames like that, but at least you open up the discussion and you take away that question of, why is he here? Why is she telling us this? So I guess that's a long-winded answer to your question, is that we do believe that what is said around a story is particularly important for advocacy. And again, there's no one way to do it. What we hope with advocates, the people we work with, that we're also building in them the ability to analyze and be strategic, to say, who's my audience tomorrow? What frames might they be carrying in? Is my story already framed? Do I not have to say anything? Great. It's that thinking of the process too, that knowing that I'm not just showing up to tell my story. I have to really think about, what is it with this audience that's different from yesterday's audience that I may need to reframe what I'm talking about.
That's good. That's good. Thank you. Thank you for reflecting on how the story is framed. And I like that you stand on the right side of this continuum, but it's essential to pass on the right thoughts in exceptionally, I mean, especially in the cases where it's a situation of trauma. Okay, here's one more question in this discussion. If the situation is less traumatic and more connected to the business goals, and in terms of corporate storytelling, should there be more or less framing, or there's no golden rule and it's also specific depending on the story?
So let me make sure I understand, just in terms of the work we do. So we've been talking kind of about individuals who are out there telling their story because they believe.
Yeah.
Very often they're working with a campaign of some sort, or an organization, or a sponsor, and so that may change the way they frame their storytelling. They may have to say, I'm here today as a representative of, and they may be even handed some messages that that organization, feels it's particularly important for them to get across. So advocates very often have to balance, this is why I'm here, and this is why I'm proud to be representing this organization with these messages as well. So there may be a little bit more crafting of that frame. But even saying I am a representative of X organization is a frame, right? And so so there may be some additional work on identifying or the language you use around your story in that sense. And sometimes it's a difficult balance, but very often advocates find those organizations. Organizations are looking for those advocates who are working on the very same goals. And in a general sense, the why we do this work is, the more stories we have out there working on the similar goal, the more success we're going to have in achieving that goal. The story of one is powerful. The story of many is incredibly powerful. So unless it's not obvious, there's a social change underpinning to all the work we do. We believe in the power of many voices to create positive change. And that's when I think advocates working with organizations or sponsors really get to feel that that power.
Wow, that's great. And I like that you've pointed out that if you're working for an advocacy organization, you should be balancing also not only the story and the frame, but also the two frames between themselves. And that's a great way to focus. Again, thank you. All right. Wow, John, thank you for all those insights you're bringing in. It's being a fabulous conversation, but as any conversation on this podcast, it somehow they all end. I don't know what's the deal with that, but I still have two questions, and I will focus them on the advocacy of storytelling, but I asked them to all the storytellers that join this show. So the first one goes like this. What would be your advice for people who want to develop their storytelling skills and they're only beginning their journey?
This reflects a little bit of the conversation we've had. I think I would tell anyone to do the two things, is that combination of reflecting on why you're doing this, knowing why you're telling us, why you're going public with a personal experience, and try to be clear as to what you are advocating for. And then the other half of that is exploring the full range of your experience. Don't discount small things in your life that may contribute. So those are the first steps always that we recommend. And know your intent, and honor your full experience.
Great. I thought you were gonna say that,
Yeah.
but it's a great way to, wrap up the experience. But second question is not about what we're talking about, because we were talking about a good story in advocacy. And here's the phrase I would like you to finish to wrap it up. It goes like this: it takes one thing to get from a good story, advocacy story, to a great story, and that one thing is.
Thank you for adding advocacy story in there. That one thing is intent. I think it's, again, being clear on why the story is being told opens up all the possibilities for how it's told and the impact you can have.
Well, let me put it this way. What makes a difference between a good intent and an intent that is really powerful? Like, is there a way to frame an intent or phrase it somehow that make it really, really clear and neat?
I would push it a little bit then and say, what makes a good story great is being clear on the vision that you're aiming for. What does the better world look like? I think that is what makes a great story, is when your listeners can see with you what is possible.
Oh, great. I like how stories, things that happened in the past, are defined by the way we see the future through them. And that's a great way to see a great story. Thank you so much. That's an insight for me.
Thank you.
John, it's been a great talk. And just to wrap it up, can you share your contacts and the way people can find you on online for the people who are interested in advocacy storytelling?
Absolutely. Probably the easiest way to find us is to go to our website, which is livingproofadvocacy.com. And that's where Tim and I talk about what the book is, but also the kind of work we do. And you can read a lot more of advocate stories there on the site and on our blog, and some of the organizations we work with and the incredible work that they are doing.
Perfect. I'll leave a link in the description. And thank you so much for joining the show. It's been a pleasure to explore this topic with you. Have a great day ahead of you.
Thank you so much for contacting me. Great to talk to you as well.